In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Fuchsia. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This ink had a rough start. Being in the destroyer of paper and ink, the Noodler's Ahab with a Fude nib. You'll see it in the writing samples. This is a beautiful purple or magenta on the page. It is a very nice color. I am really enjoying it ever so much, really, other than when it's in the destroyer of ink and paper. There's plenty of tone variation by pen, and it shades quite nicely when it does it. I did a great injustice to this ink, as so many papers aren't fountain pen papers in the writing sample. Oh well. The pens used are super wet, so spoiler, it bleeds a lot in the writing sample, but that's the pen, not the ink. In a normal pen for humans, it behaved much better than you'll see in the writing samples. It really does much better than mostly comes through. I would pay the most attention to what you're seeing now and what you'll see on the Clairfontaine. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Mr. Pen Italics Chaplin's Tankard with an oblique italic nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get really, really cool shading. Look at how dark it is. So dark, it's like it wants to be black, but isn't it? It's just a super dark purple. And then it's much lighter in other areas, making this really very pretty on the page. Looking at the gold nib, it started writing much darker. However, the pen sat for a couple days before I wrote with it. The majority of the writing is much lighter than we had with the standard Ahab. This gold nib gave us no feather, no spread, very little shading. It's amazing how different it looks, considering the main difference between these two is that one is made out of gold, and it looks like an entirely different ink. The Fude nib had the same issue at the very beginning of the writing, that the pen had sat for a few days, so it was super dark to start with. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread. I am getting some sheen in those super dark areas, so just as a back note, because you're not seeing it, but I'm moving it in the light, I'm getting a little bit of sheen in all of those super dark areas from before. Does it shade? Yes, it does. Looking at the back of the page, in spite of how super dark some of those areas were, we get no ghosting, no bleeding, easily using the back of the page. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Noodler's Ahab with an extra fine nib. A Noodler's Ahab with a medium nib. A Noodler's Ahab with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we have really the lightest tone that we had seen on the Clairfontaine, and it's fairly consistent in its tone here now, much lighter than before. We get some feathering, we get some spread. Now, both the feathering and the spread, I think, are manageable in this case. It's a nice tone, no shading whatsoever. The paper's really taking care of that. Looking at the gold nib, it is a little lighter than we had with the standard Ahab. We're still getting some little bits of feathering. I think the feathering is just a little bit less. I think we have a little less spread, kind of weird, but I think the slightly lighter tone means we're getting a little less ink here. We're still not getting any kind of shading, and really, this tone here I don't care for, so I wouldn't want to use this ink on this paper. Looking at the Fude nib, it is darker than we had with the standard Ahab. It's the darkest tone on the page. It's feathering, though the feathers are small and very manageable. I want to say it's spreading, but because I'm using the Fude nib, it's much harder to be able to tell. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a pass and not even talk about whether it spreads on the Fude nib. I'm going to give that up because that's more of a me problem, I think. Looking at the back of the page, you would swear that it would have bled all over everything in the next page. It didn't, though you can't use the back of the page because of how deep the ink is. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get a very different tone of purple or magenta than we had on the other papers. The tone of the paper really did affect this quite a bit. Not in an unpleasant way, but it looks like a different ink. There's almost no feathering. There's almost no spread. Really doing very well there. There's a couple of moments that you could say there's a little bit of shading. I really wouldn't. Don't expect it. Looking at the gold nib, we get basically the same tone that we had with the standard Ahab. We get almost no feathering, really tiny when it's there. We have almost no spread, super manageable. We get a few spots that are going to happen with some shading. In Wonderful, the L looks a little bit darker. In Discovered, the D looks a little bit darker. But not really that I'd say you would expect shading to go on here. Looking at the Fude nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the gold nib. We get feathering, yes. I'm skipping the spread. It's hard. It's a part of what I say. There's no shading whatsoever. The tone is very different than the tones that we got from the other pens. This paper's really brought a very interesting array of tones from this ink. Looking at the page underneath, there's a number of spots that I circled that it did bleed through and touch those pages. And when you see the back of the page, there's no reason to wonder why. There's no using the back of this page because of the ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the AHAB nib, we get no feather. We get no spread. We get shading. So we have a very interesting tone going on that's shading in a very nice way. It looks very similar in tone to what we had on the last paper, very different from what we had on the Clairfontaine. The color of the papers, as has been the case and expected, does change the tone of this ink. Looking at the gold nib, it is the same kind of tone, just lighter. The same kind of purple, but a lighter tone of it. Yeah, that's how we'll say it. Than we had with the standard AHAB. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. There is a little bit of shading that's going on. I'm going to take back the feather part because and on the top line, the D has some tiny feathers and the T of subject on the second line. But so unnoticeable, not really a big deal. Go ahead and don't have a problem with this. Looking at the Fude nib, it feathers a lot and consistently, practically all over the spot. It's not the best for it, but I don't know that Fude nibs are used by stenographers. Are there stenographers still? We get no shading, really. I mean, maybe there's a couple of light spots if we go searching for it, but for the most part, we get a much darker tone than everything else on the page, and that's it. Looking at the page underneath, you can see how many spots I circled because of its coming through and bleeding. Now, looking at the back of the page, you see why it happened as the ink got so deep. Tons of ghosting, no using the back of the page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Sailor Kin Mokusai. Here is Tag Cairo Iro Soft Snow of O'Hara. Here is Thornton's Violet. Here is Visconti Purple. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, the tone is very similar to what we were actually seeing on the Clairfontaine. We're not getting very much feather. It's really super under control, doing so nice. We are getting no spread. We're not really getting any shading, even though I can spot a couple of dark letters like the N in trigonometric on the second line, but I wouldn't call this shading for what I'm seeing. The gold nib is a lighter tone of what we have with the standard AHAB. We're not really getting any feathering. There's a couple tiny spots, but let's give it a break. There's no spread, so it's doing very well. This is shading, though. We see much more consistently dark letters. Like one is much darker. Constant starts dark, gets light, and gets dark again. Just starts lighter and gets darker. I'll say here we actually get some shading. Looking at the Fude nib, much darker than the other tones on the page. It feathers a lot. Lots. But that's okay because we have 20-pound paper to go, so I'm sure it can be worse. We get no shading. We get an interesting tone. It's actually doing very well here. This is not my favorite of papers, but I am very happy with what I'm seeing so far. Looking at the page underneath, the funny thing is the bleed spots are from the standard AmPad nib, not from the others, which is very funny because look at how deep it got on the Fude, and the golden standard did fine. I just don't think you can use the back of the page. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diamine. They're ultra green. Here is a gray ink by Private Reserve. They're gray flannel. Here is a pink ink by Sailor. They're Storia Dancer Pink, a pigmented ink. Here is a yellow ink by Pilot. They're mixable yellow. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, we get feathering. We'll call it a smidgen here and there and everywhere, really constantly. It spreads. It doesn't shade. It is a purple on the page. Now, I don't have a lot of high expectations considering how much this ink has bled on other papers. Not the best choice of pens, but this is the world we have. Looking at the gold nib, we get very much the same tone that we had with the standard nib. It does feather. It does spread. Neither of those things seem to be surprising me. It doesn't shade. It's an interesting purple or magenta. It's one of those that's like right in the middle that I could throw in either category, and I'm not exactly sure where it's going to end up. No shading. It's nice. It's a nice color. If it doesn't bleed, I'll call it a winner. Looking at the Fude nib, it is darker than everything else we had on the page. Funny, it actually feathers just about the same, which I expected this to be just a woolly beast, and it wasn't. Now, it's not shading. I'll actually say this is pretty good performance considering what I was expecting for this one. The Destroyer of Papers is perhaps got a cold and a little bit slower in this case, where this is a strong piece of 20-pound paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get the Destroyer of Papers. It bled through constantly. You have no chance ever of using the page underneath or the back of the page when you're using these pens with this ink. Although, to be fair, this paper doesn't usually do well. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The super dark tone is very nice. That almost black but definitely purple, very nice. I love that from a very wet broad. Although, I really like being able to see the purple and what it can do. So I think if you wanted that super dark tone, any kind of fire hose size nib will do it. I want the lighter tone though, so I really would prefer to get the best qualities from a medium to dry fine or medium nib. I think it does real justice for this ink. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.